Okay, Tamar.
Um, I'll let you know in a minute. Sophie's just
It's saying at the top it's being
is
live
it?
streamed. Yeah,
Okay. Okay. Lovely. Yeah, you can start then. Thank you.
smashing. Thank you very much. Welcome all to this morning's meeting. I'd like to begin by welcoming those members of the public and press who are watching via the live stream of the meeting that's just started via the council's website. Minutes of the meeting will be produced in the usual way, and a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the meeting page of the council website. To enable the meeting to run in an orderly manner, I'd ask all members of the forum who have video cameras to keep their video cameras switched on for the duration of the meeting and to keep their microphones muted except when I invite you to speak. Officers will join us to introduce their reports in the same way. Any members wishing to ask a question or make a comment should indicate this by clicking the raised hand function on the right hand side of their screen. When I invite you to speak, please unmute your microphone, ask your question and then mute it again to allow the officer to respond. I'd ask for your patience if we run into any technical problems, and should this occur, I'll declare an adjournment while the fault is addressed and the public broadcast will be paused. If it is not possible to address the fault, the meeting may be abandoned until such a time as it can be reconvened. I'd like to welcome, and I haven't managed to check as people were dropping in, but it's kind of a bit of an announcement as well at the same time, that we're welcoming 3 new members of the forum. We hopefully have Mark Little, CFO at the Eastern Learning Alliance. Adam, I don't know how to pronounce your surname, Adam. Dorbin?
Dabin.
Dabin, all right. It was going to be the one I didn't pick.
I answer to
Dave,
most things.
thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for your good grace in saying that. From the Horizons Education Trust, and Jonathan Lewis, the CEO of Diamond Learning Partnership. So welcome to all. Tamar, do you have any apologies for absence you'd like to let us know about?
Yes. Apologies received from Ryan Kelsall, John Young, Helena Marsh, Yolanda Botham, Adrian Miller, Councillor Christine Whelan, Mark Little, and Jonathan Lewis.
Okay, so 2 of those welcomed aren't here, but that's okay.
Yeah.
They're still welcome anyway when they do manage to join us. Does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? No. Okay. So we'll move from that section onto the next item, which really popped out yesterday, which was where Tamar managed to get the minutes from the last meeting finished and created. So if we could have a look at the minutes for accuracy, I realise they came round in a separate email rather than in the main pack. As per usual, I'll just quickly drop down the pages and ask for anybody to make any comments that they feel on page 1, page 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. With no comments, then I think we've all agreed that we'll take the minutes as a correct record. With regard to the action log, members are asked to note the updates on the action log. I don't know if anybody wanted to pick up, because there's quite a comment in 19C, because most of the other things about volunteers, etc., and caught up, I believe, the report to the January forum, but the piece around section 106 and the rest of it, I think we've all had, or hopefully had, an opportunity to quickly have a read through it. But does anybody just want to give a quick pop or just let us know what the next stage is? Thank you very much, Sarah.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find my yellow hand there. But
Don't worry.
yeah, this was raised at the last meeting, wasn't it? Because we were asked about the creative use of Section 106 funding to ensure that we support SEND, because obviously we have seen huge increases. So we have confirmed that we had a previous report that went to our Children and Young People's Committee where the yield, so the amount of funding that would be derived from Section 106 allocations, the percentage has been increased to recognise that increased demand in SEND. So when we get a Section 106 allocation now, we have a higher percentage of funding that can support SEND. We've also received from Nikki the Berry report. So we are going to look through that and see if we can learn anything and add anything to our current approach. But we feel that because we previously went to committee and increased that yield, it does reflect that increase in demand. But we're happy to come back to a future forum to have to look at how we are responding to that very report that was shared by Nikki.
Yeah, I don't know if that went to all members, but it was a very interesting piece in terms of the way in which we can use that. And being in Cambridgeshire as such a growing authority, if there's methods that we can use, I'm presuming you can't go retrospective and use it for things that have been agreed in the past where maybe pupil yields are no longer coming forward. Because as we know, with the dropping pupil numbers across the county, some of the things that have been written in as triggers may never actually happen now. I don't know if that's worth exploring. I'm guessing we won't be able to get anywhere with it, but if there's funds there to be able to be used for improving schools or those things, I just wonder how far that's worth exploring too.
Yeah, I don't think we can. I think you're right. We can't go retrospectively, but we would have to review whether that section 106 was allocated with a send, allocation. We can't, if it wasn't, we're not able to retrospectively change the scheme. But certainly going forward, we can be more creative and learn from other national good practice, and that's what we'll aim to do. Reviewing the reports that's been
the
shared.
direct comments, as you know, in 106, sometimes they're suitably vague to enable a little bit of latitude, and sometimes they're very specifically tied, aren't they, to an extra 15 students at this one school or something. But I think, yeah, maybe having a review with this in mind to see if there's anything there. It's not like we don't need the money, is it? We need everything we can get. So, okay. Thank you ever so much for that. If we could note it as something just for a future update as well, I think it's something that a lot of people will be interested in, Tamar, and it'd be great if we could start funding some of the things that we need to do in Cambridgeshire using money coming in from that. I think that's it's one of those very few things where there's an opportunity that isn't going to cost us in a nice way. Okay. Thank you ever so much for that. Thank you for your input there, Sarah, and thank you again to Nikki and other colleagues for raising issues that hopefully will help to benefit us all. Okay. If we can move on now to the next item, and the main item is the school's budget setting work. Can I ask Sarah and Martin to introduce the report? If you take us through the presentation, pause as you usually do at suitable moments, and then I'll pick up anything that we need to do with questions or votes, etc. at that point. To smash
Yeah,
Thank you.
Will do. Brilliant. Okay, I'll start this. And I'm sorry, again, you're going to have to listen to me for the next 20 minutes or so as I kind of update you on this and go through. And hopefully it all kind of makes sense in terms of where we're at. Okay, so just going to run through latest updates and the methodology that we've used in terms of the illustrative modelling, some kind of updates around the kind of the observations and sort of alternative options we've considered in conversation with Mark when I shared the kind of the original illustrative figures as well. And then just some obviously going to ask primary reps to vote on the de-delegations and then just go through what we think is going to be required in terms of actions and next steps as we move into January. So as we kind of said, just as a bit of a refresher in terms of what was published on the 19th of November, no material changes to the school's funding formula. Local authorities required to move 10% closer to the national funding formula. And as we said, that's not an issue for Cambridgeshire because we're already aligned with that. Baselining of historic grants into the 26-27 funding. And there'll be a separate grant announced in due course in relation to the expansion of free school meal eligibility from September 26 in terms of that. The November update also included those initial national funding formula factor values and kind of done a little bit more analysis on that on the next slides. I think important thing is there was and still remains no update on high needs block whatsoever, and as yet no update on the early years block either. So obviously that kind of is obviously half of the picture really in terms of some of the other conversations, which we'll obviously have to come back to in January once we get the final settlement, hopefully next week. So in terms of the figures, so I think at the last meeting we kind of presented a similar table to this, but what we've now actually done is we've now split out, as kind of was discussed at the meeting, the kind of the impact of the baselining of the grants and just the general uplift in terms of the individual formula factors. So you can see, for example, so taking the primary and the secondary basic entitlement figures at the top there, you can see in each case they've had primaries had £135 additional added around the baselining of grants, secondaries had 148 and 167 pounds respectively for key stage 3 and key stage 4. But when you take that out of the equation, you can see that actually the uplift compared to the previous year is 2.2% on those factors. So if you go down, you can see where the baselining of grants has been applied and what the kind of the overall impact is of any further inflationary uplift applied. So really, you're looking at around a kind of an average around 2% inflation has been applied to the different factors when you take out the baselining of grants, which is obviously the biggest impact for a number of those factors. And that's similar for the other factors around low prior attainment, lump sum, etc., etc. As we said previously, minimum per pupil has not had any inflationary uplift applied to it over and above the baselining of grants. So it's gone up from the previous figures of 4955 for primary and 6465 for secondary, and that the only uplift which has been applied to those two minimum per pupil figures is purely the baselining of grants from the previous years. So no further inflationary uplift applied to that, and that's key when we get on to some of the modelling later on in the presentation. So in terms of the local funding formula, I've now managed to undertake some initial illustrative modelling based on that data that was presented or published on the 19th of November. Key thing to remember with all of this is that all of this illustrative modelling is based on last year's data sets, and therefore we're still waiting for the October 25 pupil data and census information, which, as I say, hopefully we'll receive next week, although we have now got some very early census information, which I'll speak about later on in the presentation. So really the purpose of this initial modelling is to provide that guide on what the potential impact is of the national changes to kind of support the decision making. So I think, as I say, it's very important to remember these are not final budgets in any way, shape or form. This is really illustrative at this side, because obviously the changes in pupil data are going to impact significantly on a school level basis. So I've completed effectively 6 scenarios in terms of this. First scenarios 1 to 5 show the impact of block transfers ranging from 0% up to 1% in terms of the figures in there. Scenario 6 also, we've done a little bit of a kind of a look at what would happen if we maximise the amount that we put through the lump sum, just to give an indication of how much that could impact on individual schools as well, just to see what we could potentially do to kind of try and support some of the schools where the kind of the national changes or their individual circumstances were kind of having a detrimental effect because of the changes there. I've applied the variations to pupil numbers, exceptional premises, business rates, etc., all at 25, 26 levels. And again, they will be updated on receipt of the final information. Baselined the grants based on what the DfE have published for the national insurance contributions and school budget support grant for both primary and secondary. And as we agreed last time, we've reduced the amount of funding that we're going to retain for centrally retained growth from 2 million to 1.5 million, which again obviously helps in terms of the overall amount available. Minimum funding guarantee has been set at 0% per pupil, which is the maximum allowable as per the DfE guidance. And in the initial versions, the minimum per pupil levels have also been set at the levels dictated by the DfE in the recently published guidance as well. So as I say, we've got limited flexibility now because of the national funding formula and that requirement to move 10% closer, but there are still a couple of things that we can do as we'll come on to shortly. So this is just a kind of a summary of the kind of overall levels in terms of each of the 6 scenarios I mentioned, what the total amount for distribution would be in each of those scenarios based on the block transfers from 0% up to 1%, and then in scenario 6, the 0.5%, but with the increased overall lump sum. So first thing to mention, in all of these cases, the minimum factor values, which are a requirement of the DFE. So for each of the factors, there's a minimum and maximum amount we're allowed to set within those amounts. And in each of these scenarios at the moment, we meet those minimum value factors. Again, in each of these, you can see, depending on how much the block transfer is, obviously the total amount of requirement for scaling of the funding factors changes. So scenario 1, where we've got a 0% block transfer, currently in this illustrative data, we'd have to scale the factors down by a very small amount to 99.8% of the DFE figures to meet overall affordability. And as you can see, that percentage reduces down dependent on the overall available funding and how much the block transfer would actually be. And obviously, in turn, that then would have an impact on the overall percentage increase because of the amount that we would be retaining as part of the block transfer. I think the important thing, or one of the interesting things as we kind of look at the cost of funding the minimum per pupil levels and the cost of meeting the minimum funding guarantee, these are much reduced from previous years. And I think, and as you can see by the number of schools impacted by the MFG and minimum per pupil levels, quite a low number of schools within that kind of who would be receiving that protection as well. That's primarily, and again, we'll come on to it, that's primarily because of the 0% being applied to both the MPPL uplift and also the 0% per pupil based on the MFG as well. So less schools are getting protected by the DFE's protection mechanisms because of the changes they've made to the levels of uplifts available for those factors. So again, each of the scenarios 1 to 6, again, this shows the level of kind of factoring scaling down that we've had to do for each of the scenarios that we've ran through at the moment. So again, if you look at scenario 1, for example, the basic entitlement for primary would be £4,111, and obviously that would then reduce down dependent on the level of scaling and overall affordability, depending on any block transfers in terms of that. And that same principle applies to all of the other factors for each of the scenarios that we've kind of ran through in terms of that there. The only difference to that is in scenario 6, where, as you can see in the lump sum figures, we've increased that lump sum to 158,612, which is the maximum that we're allowed to do in terms of the allowable factor values. Obviously, again, that's had a slight impact on some of the other factors because, again, of the overall affordability. So has had to reduce down the kind of the overall value. So, for example, if you compare scenario 3, which is a 0.5 block transfer, and then scenario 6, which is also a 0.5 block transfer, but with a maximum lump sum, you can see, for example, that the primary basic entitlement in ORPU has reduced by £10 to be able to afford that increased value of the lump sum for all schools. And again, that same principle applies for all of the other funding factors. So just a few of the kind of the key observations and findings from that work we've kind of undertaken. So obviously the prior to any of the block transfers and and including that recycling of that 0.5 million, they're the kind of the overall uplift is in the region of around 3.4%, but we know in reality that won't be the case because of individual school circumstances. So schools that were on the minimum funding guarantee and or the minimum per pupil levels in 25-26 are showing very, very minimal uplift in funding. In fact, some schools are seeing a 0% uplift in funding due to the level of funding that they received in the current financial year, already being the equivalent to the revised 26-27 minimum funding guarantee, or MPPL. I had one school and I couldn't work out why it wasn't getting any uplift until I looked back, and it just happened to be coincidental that the level of funding they received this year was exactly the same as what the next year's MPPL is. And it's those kind of nuances in terms of the way in which those protection works, which does impact on some individual schools. Obviously, another big impact is going to be around that baselining of the grants. So obviously, the way in which the grants were allocated in the current financial year is going to differ to how it's allocated through the funding formula, because of the way in which either the weightings have been applied by the DfE and the methodologies between the two. So we have seen that in some cases, some schools are receiving very different levels of funding. Now the grants are being allocated via the funding formula rather than those kind of standalone allocations. And again, that's going to be very much on a case-by-case basis for individual schools. As I've already mentioned, the significantly reduced number and cost of schools on MFG and MPPL because of the levels in which they're set at. Not necessarily a good thing. On the one hand, obviously, we want to see less schools in need of that protection, but on the other hand, it isn't therefore protecting those schools who are already on it and giving them some level of uplift in terms of that. One thing just to note as well, there are two schools where at the moment there are no baseline figures from the DfE. They've not been able to provide anything. And when I did go back to them and query this, they have come back to say that will be data that will be available in the next iteration of the information. So again, for two of those schools, their figures might look a little bit odd because there are no baseline data available for them at the moment in terms of that. So as I've already mentioned, they've already met all of the minimum funding factor values in each of those scenarios. The continued inclusion of the lump sum in the minimum per pupil calculation, though, does artificially inflate the figure for small schools. And this is something, again, I think I've said before, we've argued for a while now, that actually by including a lump sum in what is effectively a per pupil calculation doesn't actually make sense. So it artificially inflates those MPPL figures for smaller schools, which means effectively they're not actually seeing any kind of benefit of the uplift in funding because they're already above those MPPL levels. So following kind of conversations with Mark via email, we did have a look at some kind of other scenarios to see, kind of just take a judgment as to whether we did feel there'd be any overall benefit or benefit to specific schools, specifically small schools who were seeing a minimal uplift. So we reduced the MFG to minus 0.5%. And this made very, very little difference to the overall figures. Overall, it reduced the cost of the minimum funding guarantee by about £15,000 and made less than £200 difference to most schools. So we discounted that as an option that wouldn't provide any benefit. As I've already said, we increased the lump sum to the maximum allowable for both primary and secondary schools, which is the scenario 6 in the figures that we've shared. Effectively, this moved around £360,000 from secondary to primary, because obviously you've got more primaries. So if you're spending more money on lump sums in primary, that's going to be a bigger cost overall. The biggest schools within secondary would then therefore end up losing around £15,000 to £16,000. And despite moving that money across, the biggest gain in the primary sector was around only around £3,500 for a small primary in terms of that. So again, very minimal impact overall in terms of the impact of changing that. But the final thing we did was we looked at what would happen if we increased the minimum per pupil levels by the area cost adjustment. So this is not something the DfE actually do. The minimum per pupil levels and do not have the area cost adjustment to them applied like all of the other factors. But we're just trying to understand what that would mean if we did kind of apply for this application and take that as a route to try and provide some protection to schools. bizarrely, well, not bizarrely, I suppose, when you think about what I said earlier, it actually had it more than doubled the cost of meeting the minimum per pupil levels, and again had a disproportionate impact on small schools and more deprived schools, because those schools are historically the schools who've had a higher level of per pupil funding. So what it was doing, it was bringing the other schools up to that level, and in order to do that, it was reducing the funding that those smaller schools and more deprived schools got, because their minimum per pupil levels already exceed those new higher levels. So again, not something we would recommend as kind of an option to look at in terms of that. I don't know, Mark, whether it's worth pausing at that point, because I think that's quite a lot of detail in that, in terms of that. So I'll take the screen off, and then just take any comments, observations. Obviously, I appreciate what I haven't put up on the screen is the individual school level figures, which were shared with you separately. And obviously there's quite a lot of detail in there as well. So if there's any kind of points of clarification or comments on anything I've discussed or any of the data that's been shared, please feel free to raise.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much, Martin. I should start with a thank you for your patience, because what we were talking about all the way through was, I think, trying to move around what we know is not enough money around a system to try to find a fair, equitable, balanced, and as Martin says, the other papers represent what it does to individual schools, but certainly asking Martin a question, thinking about what we thought were the major problems with the way it fell, and trying to push it around to find different answers. Yeah, his patience and detail and the fairness that comes through in the answers that he gave around, I don't think this is a good idea because of this, I don't think, and you look at how that affects, I thought was it was rather heartening and wonderful. So thank you, sir. Richard, I see your hand is up now.
Hi, Martin. I think I remember last time reference to EDACI 2025 and whether there's been a clarification on that.
Yes, there has. Apologies. Yeah, I did mean to mention that. So yes, I contacted DFE about that. The response I got from them was the fact that although the EDACI has been updated for 2025, it was too late for the DFE to include in the data sets for this year. However, they will be including it in the data sets for next year's budget. So based on what they've said, no changes for this year's data, but next year's information will be updated to reflect the 2025 data.
Lovely. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Richard. Any other colleagues with questions? So there's a huge amount to work out in there and still more information that will follow through. But I think it puts us in a really good position for when we meet again, obviously in that short time of January, for us to have possibly digested all of that a little bit further and then see how other factors may play their way through. I know colleagues are still kind of trying to make sense of things like pay statements of 6.5% loaded towards the end. That sounds like 2% and a bit per year, doesn't it? Which is roughly the inflation, but does that mean it's going to be less than that? I'm sure a number of colleagues have also seen things like pension settlements coming through and some of those changes. So we're all at that point in the year where we're trying to pin a tail into a constantly moving donkey. It's no fun whatsoever at all. But I think with the modelling that we've got, we should be well placed to be able to make some informed, if painful, decisions possibly still. I've been asked by one colleague by text, what is the right answer? And I don't think there is one at this point. It's not that straightforward, unfortunately. There'll be different right answers for different individual schools, clearly, but how you then manage that as a whole county, I think, is the complexity we face in this committee, and obviously officers and CYP, etc., do as well. But thank you again for all of that work. I think the transparency and commitment is absolutely great. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And I think you're right.
Sorry, go on, Martin.
So I was going to say, just before I go on to the next section, I think, yeah, you're right. And I think that's part of, again, what we found from doing that kind of, you asking all your questions and us doing that variable modeling. What it found, as I say, is that actually we haven't got as many levers as we've had previously to move money around the system. So where we were trying to, taking small schools as an example, where we were trying to find a way of giving more money to small schools, actually it has, as I said, it has an impact over here, and it doesn't have the desired impact there. So there's less and less flexibility in the system now because of that move towards the national funding formula. That is meaning that we haven't got that. And with the levels, with the MPPL and the way in which that interacts with the MFG, it does have a lot of unintended consequences when you start moving money around the system because of those protections, which in the way in which they're put through the formula. So yeah, as Mark said, some difficult decisions, and I don't think there is a right answer in terms of that. Shall I move on to the next section now?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So okay, so just a kind of a few things. So obviously, again, we touched on this at the last meeting. This is the exceptional premises factor, which applies to these 5 schools, and we'll be asking Forum to formally approve the continuation of that factor. The DFE have come back with a number of questions based on what we've submitted to them in terms of the disapplication. I think they're happy with all of those, and they're now just waiting for a forum view before kind of giving us permission to continue with that factor. In terms of this, again, we touched on this last time. This is the de-delegations which apply to our maintained primary schools only, and we're not proposing to make any changes to the rates which are applied for 26-27 for these individual de-delegations. However, we are proposing to make a small change to the education functions kind of retained funding, and then that's to reflect a lot of the additional work we're putting in to support maintained schools in financial difficulty, and this is to try and to give us some kind of capacity to support those, because based on the previous conversations and obviously future conversations, we know there are going to be a lot more schools and a lot more maintained schools in financial difficulty going forward, and we want to be able to support those in the best way as we can as possible. So we'll come on to the votes on those at the moment. We also, last time we spoke about the growth fund and variation to pupil numbers. Excuse me. We're having conversations with schools at the moment, schools and trusts around their variation to pupil numbers. I was actually just in a meeting prior to Forum having a conversation about one of our secondary schools and variation to numbers. And obviously, subject to finalisation of those, we'll share those at the meeting of Schools Forum in January, and they will be factored into the future modelling. What I would ask for, though, is whether it's in this meeting now or by email outside of this meeting, is for some volunteers to sit on the secondary panel for the Growth Fund on 28th of January is the proposed date for that, or the primary panel, which is going to be held in February with the actual date to be approved. And I say that's just a request for a couple of head teacher representatives from each of those sectors to kind of sit on those panels and help myself and place planning colleagues kind of run through the growth fund situation and kind of make decisions on those schools as we discussed at the previous meeting. So as I say, we'll come back to that in a minute, but again, it might be something that we want to do via email outside this meeting, but just a request for volunteers to support that process. This slide wasn't in your original pack, and it's something I just quickly added this morning. So received the initial unvalidated October census figures last night, yesterday evening, and as we kind of touched on previously, we're seeing, and this is the first time I can ever remember both sectors seeing a net reduction from year to year in terms of this, but a further 791 pupils net reduction across the primary ages, and that includes those primary age pupils in our all through secondaries as well, and a net decrease of 26 pupils across the secondary sector as well. Obviously, that is, not all going to be in kind of one area, and there are some significant reductions in some of our primary schools, which again, I'm sure you're aware of. For those of you in multi-academy trusts, you're probably seeing those across your areas, which is likely to require class organisations to be reconfigured. Obviously, that reduction of over 800 pupils in total will have an impact on our final DSG allocation that we receive, because obviously the DFE will apply those formula factors at a national level to our revised pupil data. And based on some very quick estimates I completed this morning, I think the amount of funding that we get for the estimated for the growth, the falling roles fund allocation, which we get a part of the DSG, I think that looks as though that's going to reduce from around 2.5 million to 2 million pounds this year because of that reduction in overall numbers across the county, which is completely coincidental that it's the same £500,000 difference we've talked about reducing the retained growth fund down from 2 million to 1.5 million. But what that hopefully should mean is that actually from a school's budget perspective, in terms of the impact it has on the formula, it should actually have minimal impact, because that £500,000 we've kind of recycled back into the pot by reducing that retained funding in terms of that. Again, all of those figures are still subject to validation and the confirmation by the DFE, but as I say, it does kind of, when I started looking at individual schools, it did paint quite a stark picture for some of them in terms of the reductions in pupil numbers that they're seeing in terms of that, and in all of them, there doesn't look as though there's going to be, in terms of looking at the forecast data, there isn't an obvious upturn in numbers in the coming years for a number of these schools as well. So so for any of the maintained schools that we're working with, we'll kind of liaise with them around, you know, what actions are being taken around those around that reduction of pupil numbers and managing that as part of the process. So again, this is a kind of another slide I've just added in because I was just starting to think about, and you know, and Mark touched about it, about the modelling we need to put forward for January and what we need to pull together. So obviously this is obviously subject to a further steer from yourselves and any comments that you might have. But what I'm proposing at the moment is this is going to be the approach that I'm going to take to the final modelling that we'll produce, which will be presented to both yourselves and to CYP committee in January. So proposing that we only base it on a 0% and a 0.5% block transfer scenario. Officers, we've spoken with senior colleagues in the organisation as well, and looking at the overall affordability, we think anything above 0.5% would be too much of an impact on individual schools. So as a local authority, the maximum we would be proposing if we went down that route would be 0.5%. So in terms of modelling, only propose modelling that 0% and 0.5% scenarios for the purpose of that decision making. Minimum funding guarantee, we've already said we would set that at 0%, which is the maximum allowable. Minimum per pupil levels we would set at the DFE levels. Retained growth, as we've said, we would set that at 1.5 million rather than the 2 million it was last year, as was discussed and approved at last meeting. And then we would apply the variation to pupil numbers subject to those conversations with individual schools and trusts as well, and then scale those factors. So that was kind of the approach, to say, subject to any comments or any other suggestions from colleagues here, trying to keep it effectively to two main scenarios that we'd be looking at for consideration at the January meeting based on that updated data sets, although there might be some other kind of slight variations people think we need to consider as part of those conversations as well. Right, so that's the kind of the end of that section, and kind of the main areas is just asking people to note and comment on what I've just presented, and as I say, just confirm either happy with that or approach that I've proposed on the previous slide, or to give me a steer about what other areas they would like me to consider and look at. I'd like you to approve the continuation of the historic exceptional premises factor arrangements, and then would like to ask primary representatives to approve the dedelegations and the retained funding. So I'll pause there and I'll remove the slides again for ease of use and take any comments or questions at this stage.
Thank you very much, Martin. Colleagues, questions? None at the moment. Just a couple of very quick comments. I think what you've just talked about makes the urgency of area-wide places planning absolutely critical. I don't think it makes an awful lot of sense if we're all acting individually to start messing around with PAN numbers and those kind of items and communities. I think it's something we're going to need CCC to be a lead on in terms of bringing those communities together. There's a long-term planning piece in secondary, but forgive me, I think it was 791. That's like a couple of primary schools that have ceased to exist in Cambridgeshire in the last year. And yet I don't think that's the case of actual. So somehow we're going to have to make this stretch. I think there are some really critical things to be decided upon there. So it'd be really useful to have some update on how we're forming a strategy through primary, secondary head CEOs group. I see John over there on my screen. How we're going to do that collectively together to make sure meet the needs of young people, but also make it affordable in the envelope that we're being provided with. Hugely complex. And I think the 0.5%, 0% indicates the pain that you've seen on the way through for the way schools are going to have to be suffering. And so thank you for the empathy there, because I think the risk of the 1% was playing very heavily on a lot of people's minds. So if we're going to 0 to 0.5, at least it starts to narrow down the things that we're having to think about.
Yeah.
So very much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's certainly the thinking as we started going through the individual impacts on schools. Just in terms of the place planning, yeah, I've had some initial conversations with place planning colleagues on this, and I know as part of that as well, we're looking at kind of focusing on the small school strategy around looking at small schools across the county and looking at the kind of approach to that. And I think you're right, it's working between maintained schools and academy trusts to work out what that total number of places is in a local area, because when you start looking at some of those local areas, there are not enough pupils to kind of make the number of schools sufficient that we've got there at the moment. So that's certainly something that needs to be taken forward. So Sarah, maybe we'll speak to kind of Alison and place planning colleagues, and maybe that's something we'll need to bring back to a future meeting.
Yeah. I was going to come in. Thanks, Martin. I don't know why I had a floating thumb, but yeah, you're absolutely right, Mark, in terms of the challenge of the strategic planning around place planning. We've got a large number of very small schools, and we are starting to see the impact of falling roles in mainstream, but also we've got the challenge, when we talked earlier around the section 106 for SEND, we've got the challenge of rising demand for SEND. So we need to be strategically planning to accommodate both of those. And also it links with what Martin was saying earlier in terms of the growing number of schools in deficit and the impact on their financial viability that's compromised by that increased demand for SEND. So I think we've got to think more creatively, haven't we, both in terms of that smaller schools strategy, but also how are we looking at this from a capital assets perspective and growing to respond to the demand in SEND more creatively. So it would probably be quite useful if we perhaps set out a plan of school engagement around that. And we'd probably share this outside of this meeting, Mark, but potentially we could bring it into, I don't know which forum's most appropriate, but we've got high needs blocks working group, haven't we, coming up? So is it an option to perhaps pick up in there? So definitely need to have a strategic plan that fully engages with our schools, though. So take that and we'll pick it up in the appropriate forum and perhaps bring it back here once we've worked that up.
No, thank you very much. I see John's made a comment about happily trying to engage with CEOs on that. I think it is definitely small schools, but what we've been observing as well is where you're moving from being 1.5 forms of entry to 1 form of entry, or 2 forms of entry to 1.5 forms of entry. I'm sure colleagues find it about as helpful as I do to have KPIs sent around average class sizes that we need to have to run a viable school that seem completely at odds with what it actually needs to have as class sizes if you're going to service the communities that you're supposed to be servicing. And that's where we reach this point where it becomes completely unaffordable. And that's a conversation I think that goes beyond just us in forum. I think it's an obvious national conversation to say we're going to start watching class sizes or PAN sizes which are reduced. The methodology for that is complicated, Byzantine, and not necessarily something that any individual can do on their own. And the fact that how do we manage to make the books balance? Because I can't work out an answer to it, to be honest, as we look. Leslie, I see you've raised your hand.
I think there's a wider conversation. Obviously, we've got to look at pupil numbers and staffing and so on, but I think there's what's the curriculum offer? What quality of education are we offering, and standards and outcomes? And, can we have a blended offer between SEND and, pupil numbers, etc.? I think we've really got to look at this, particularly with schools, close proximity. It doesn't matter what structure they're in, but we've also got to think of the practicalities for families and access. So there's a lot to think about, but I think we need to start doing that work now rather than waiting for it to bite us. Thanks.
Recruiting staff to high SEND needs groups, which are possibly being taught across 3 national curriculum groups. Sorry, not 3 national curriculum years. Right, well, good luck, especially if you're in an isolated community where it's very hard to get there. And it's lovely if people then start telling us about raising standards, but that's an almost impossible conundrum that I've just set for an extremely experienced teacher, let alone someone who's new to the profession. I do think all of these things are merging together to make life incredibly complicated. So thank you for your commitment there, Sarah, to that. I'll go back to hopefully following the rules, Martin, as were laid out. So the first thing I just ask colleagues to note and comment on the illustrative budget modelling and proposed LA approach for the school's funding formula. I'm not seeing people objecting. I wouldn't anticipate. I believe I have to ask for people to approve the continuation of the historic exceptional premises factor arrangements. Again, I will just check to see if there's anybody wishing to object. Okay, then we're over to the educational fundings and de-delegations for maintained primary school representatives to approve the proposed de-delegations. Have we got that far? We haven't got that far, have we, Martin? Or am I running on?
No, we're there. We can ask primary reps to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Approve the proposed de-delegations in respect of contingency, free school meals eligibility, maternity, trade union facilities time, and approve the proposed educational functions retained funding. I'll move to a vote on recommendation B and take it that there's a general consensus unless anyone disagrees. Nikki, you've raised your hand.
Hi, thanks, Mark. I think it's I appreciate the fact that there hasn't been an increase to the education functions funding request for quite some time, so I do understand, but I know Martin referred to it as a small increase, but actually it's a 25% increase, and I think I'd really like it noted that we do not miss the irony of schools having an increase of 25% in order to facilitate the work that needs to be done for schools going into deficit, because I think the irony of that position shouldn't go unnoted.
Yeah, no, totally, Nikki. I totally accept that, and it was something I must admit I was torn on as I was putting it forward in terms of that, because of that very, very reason. But it's as you say, it hasn't increased for a number of years, and unfortunately we're in that position now where it can't continue at the rate that it is at the moment. But yeah, I completely recognise that irony, as you say, of that.
Okay. So with that caveat acknowledged, thank you for sharing, Nikki. Okay, if we take B as reluctantly passed, that's okay, then we'll move on to items C and D, taking them together. Relates to the maintained primary school representatives only. This time I've been asked to read out your names. Please can you indicate whether you are for, against, or abstain? There are 3 colleagues, all of whom I think are here, but I'll just have to double check as we make our way through. I saw you were here earlier, Sasha.
Yes, I'm for. Thank you.
Thank you. Nikki?
Yeah, for, reluctantly.
Thank you very much. And Kate?
Yeah, for.
Tamar, I believe you're about to announce the result.
That was unanimous.
Thank you very much for letting me know that, Tamar. Excellent. Thank you very much, colleagues. I think that brings that item to a conclusion and just takes us back to the key dates.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll just quickly put those up on the screen in terms of the next steps, really, in terms of we are. So as agreed, I will hopefully, on receipt of the DFE information next week, I will update the modelling to reflect the approach that I've set out on earlier. We'll then share that with Schools Forum in early January, prior to the meeting on the 16th of January. We then have Children and Young People's Committee to approve the final budget proposals on the 20th of January. Obviously, the big key thing is obviously going to still be around the block transfer, which obviously we'll discuss at both of those meetings. And obviously, when we go to CYP committee on the 20th of January, we'll obviously have had a steer from yourselves following that 16th of January meeting. We then submit the APT to the DFE on the 22nd of January, and then we'll publish those budgets to primary and secondary schools. Obviously, they'll be illustrative for academies at kind of end of January, early February. Alongside the work that's happening on the primary and secondary budgets, early years colleagues are working or will be working on receipt of the DFE announcements around early years next week as well on the early years rates. And again, we'll be bringing back to the January meeting the initial or the proposed early years funding rates to be applied for 26-27, as well as asking Forum to approve the amount of retained funding for early years as we're required to do again. So again, that will come back to the January meeting. And alongside that, we're working with special head colleagues at the moment on a revised banding system. And again, we'll bring regular updates back to this meeting as that progresses through the next couple of months prior to the start of the next financial year.
Okay. Anybody have any questions for Martin on that? No? There's nothing else there, Tamar, for anything going forward? No. Therefore, can I ask the members of the Schools Forum to note the agenda plan? Thank you. Brings us to the end of the meeting. Hopefully short but sweet today, with an awful lot of detail that'll inform us for what comes up at the next meeting, which is due to be held on Friday, the 16th of January. And it only leaves me to thank you for your hard work during this term and the whole year, and to please ensure that you get yourself some time to rest, recuperate, and get ready for what looks like being a very busy 2026 again for all of us. So thank you, colleagues. Look after yourselves and see you in the new year. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye all.
Cheers.